When human beings slowly built human hierarchies slowly built human societies, and human societies slowly built human civilizations, 4 areas around the world stood further in the game of early human development than any others. And it's no coincidence that these few places were the cradles of civilization. They all had favorable terrain, fertile river valleys, and strong central authority, but only one of these places would grow up to be the nation of China. All early civilizations had their own secluded area of the continent, allowing them to spend less resources on defense and more resources into learning important skills, like how to fall off a pyramid and die properly, a necessary read for any Egyptian. But while Iran was invaded by Iranians, Mesopotamia was invaded by more Iranians, Egypt was invaded by a lot of Iranians, and India was invaded by Nazis, China continued to get bigger and bigger. Their only weight loss program was to have some Mongolians come over to their house and kill half their population, so China was not too keen on slowing down its growth. Being in a comfortable position not to be invaded, China had plenty of spare time to enjoy their hobbies, such as poetry, philosophy, and occasionally breaking into 20 different Chinas. You know, just China things. With rivers and stable rice fields, they had a ton of food to rely on, and more food equals more babies equals more civilization. But wait, I hear you say as you're starving in a massive famine caused by civil war, if food equals babies, then does that mean that babies equal food? No. Eating children is not okay. Unless those children are barbarians. Barbarians was a term the Chinese used to describe people they did not understand and did not care enough about to want to understand. This led to a Sinocentric perception of the world in which China was considered superior to all places, and perhaps there was good reasoning for this view. China had the strongest military in the world, the most advanced culture in the world, the largest economy in the world, the most coveted goods in the world, and most importantly, a confused philosopher with eyebrows large enough to strangle an elephant. But this view of the world caused China to reject all innovation that wasn't Chinese, because everything that isn't Chinese must be barbarian. Mongols, barbarians. Russians, barbarians. Indians, barbarians. Ottomans, barbarians. Europeans, barbarians. Hotel, Travagna, no, still barbarians. China, however, well, China was the cultural and economic center of the world, a shining beacon of light for what civilization is supposed to be, something for all nations of the world to look at and bow down to aspire to be. Just never mind those peasants starving en masse or that guy getting a saw shoved through his... But this policy stopped working when China stopped innovating, because the rest of the world was about to have a revolution. So, to sum up, in 1492 some Spaniards sailed across the ocean to find some long-lost continents. Then they traveled a bit further and found some Mexicans, also known as dead people, but don't worry, now the people are back and 100% more Spanish. And now Jesus is here. Actually, there's 2 Jesuses because a German guy wrote 95 reasons why the other Jesus is bad. It's a bestseller in Germany and now all of Central Europe is fighting itself. Then Sweden published 95 reasons why you just died from a bullet. It's a bestseller in Germany and eventually everyone stops fighting each other, but at least England found a religion that lets them murder all 8 of their wives. And the Turks found a religion that lets them grow onions on their heads, so they conquered Constantinople and turned it into an onion. Also, what happened to those long-lost continents that I mentioned a couple sentences ago and aw, damn it, Europe already killed all the natives. Okay, I guess we'll just have some wars over here and build some boats and use those boats to trade spices. I also think we have a couple more wars scheduled, like this one about Europeans arguing about things, and this one about Europeans arguing about things. Now it's time to build empires that conquer people, like this one in India. Knock knock, it's Britain, and they're here to trade things like silk, spices, and a bullet to the face. India is Britain now, and they're so happy that they all starve to death. Now let's build some factories, some industries, some trains, some goods, and... the Enlightenment. The Americas get so enlightened they stop being European. France gets so enlightened that they do very enlightened things, like behead people who aren't enlightened. Combine this with massive innovations in mathematics, navigation, economics, trade, industry, warfare, government, astronomy, politics, printing, nationhood, colonization, art, and philosophy. Welcome to a new age. This jumbled mess of events that occurred over a 400-year period doesn't really have a name, and it's often just grouped into the medieval and modern eras. But it is important because it represents a major shift in global power concentration to the continent of Europe. All of a sudden, almost all discovery and advancements were occurring in this continent, or places that this continent shaped. And in this period, China, well, all China did was this. They replaced their M with a Q, became a little more Manchu, and conquered some rocks in the desert. Muslim and Tibetan Buddhist rocks, which weren't very happy with Chinese rule. The inability of China's Qing dynasty to embrace any of the ideas that Europe was getting so high on came soon to bite them, as China received a visit from an unwelcome parasite. European colonialism was expanding across the globe, and China's sphere of influence was about to be hit next. As nations from halfway across the planet planted their flag, their military, and their culture in places ancient dynasties used to have a firm grip on, China did not care enough about barbarian politics or science to worry all that much. The age of Chinese antiquity and the heavenly mandate had never disappeared according to the Chinese mindset, no matter how far back that reality actually was. But things weren't all that bad. Farmers farmed, traders traded, and the brother of Jesus started a brutal civil war, with all of China getting involved in pointless bloodshed that produced death counts comparable to the First World War, as the brothers of Jesus are known to do. But no longer were the Qing an unstoppable, all-conquering force. No longer did the realm prosper and trade flourish. No longer did millions of people die in a catastrophic crop failure caused by a single drought. Oh, well, that one may still be happening. But no longer did China sit on top of the world, as instead the world began to sit on top of them. Like a disease, European colonialism encircled the Far East, knocking away Chinese dominance piece by piece. Speaking of diseases, British people. As advanced navigation methods allowed people to travel long ocean distances and get to anywhere in the world, a flood of traders from the burgeoning colonial empires of Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands came to China in search of valuable resources only found in the eastern regions. The prospect of capitalizing on a rapidly expanding market for Chinese goods outweighed any downsides that came with trade restrictions and Chinese protectionism. But soon, Europeans became unsatisfied with Chinese tariffs. And even sooner, the UK became unsatisfied with Chinese existence. The Qing dynasty needed to solve both the problems of angry Western traders as well as an opium epidemic imported from British India, which was rapidly taking over the population. Now was China's time to shine and show these arrogant Western powers who really ruled the world. So they took a drastic measure, something so unbelievably brash and extreme. They wrote a letter, which was never actually delivered, let alone taken seriously. The issue of Sino-British relations continued to be a big problem in the imperial court, as incidents continued to flare up tensions with the crown, and more people fell victim to the British drug trade. Something needed to be done about opium, no matter what the Then a couple British people show up saying, hey, want some drugs? Then a couple 100,000 people show up saying, hey, want some drugs? You know, just Britain things. But these were no ordinary drug dealers. They were highly British drug dealers, and they weren't going to just sell you drugs, they were going to do the highly British thing and blow up your whole nation while doing it. And in that task, they succeeded. With an advanced navy, far superior weapons, and a generally better idea of how warfare actually worked, the British decimated the poorly equipped Qing army on the battlefield, reaching the imperial capital in just 2 years, 11 months after the war started, and reversing 3,000 years of prosperity in just 3 years of war. This marked a major turning point not only in Chinese history, but in world history as well. The door was open to this massive nation, and there was nothing China could do to stop the new wave of imperialism that was about to fall upon their country. The term barbarian was no longer fitting to describe China's relationship with the West. Instead, a new term was big bad British shooty man who sells the good stuff. Immediately after the First War, China realized that they were, indeed, still very socially awkward, and Britain wasn't able to negotiate legalization of opium. So they bring over their diplomacy vessels and fire their diplomacy cannons and commit some diplomatic murder, and so set the precedent for the next few decades as colonial spheres of influence reigned over the nation. The South became severely French, the North became severely Russian, the center became severely British, and the Russians became severely dead. And China was severely not loving it. More and more people began to think that it was time for the old Chinese way of life and thinking to go. It was time for a revolution. As the year 1911 came along, revolution was sweeping the nation. The Qing dynasty was forced out onto the fringes of the empire, and a republic was declared. The evil, authoritarian, oppressive, genocidal maniac, who also happened to be a 6-year-old child, was deposed and a new CEO of China was elected. First on the agenda was to not get bought by the CEO of buying people. The CEO of buying people had different ideas. The nation was getting quite tired and fatigued from the ongoing civil war, so time for peace. President of the new republic Sun Yat-sen and military strongman leader of the Qing Yuan Shikai agreed that Yuan would get the position as president so long as he put respecting the new constitution first on the agenda. So first on the agenda was to not respect the new constitution, second on the agenda was to assassinate anyone who respected the constitution, and third on the agenda was to be forced to abdicate by everyone who respected the constitution. This led to a disintegration of whatever central authority there was left. The only present the country received for helping in World War I was getting slapped by Japan. Needless to say, the Republic hadn't had the best of starts, and China decided that existing was no longer in its best interests. Warlords and local cliques scrambled to seize control of their share of the region. But there was still hope for the revolutionaries, as a Soviet-backed nationalist movement led by our good pal Sun Yat-sen had a new thesis: democracy. And it also might be a dictatorship. And if I feel like it, I might massacre the communists. But don't worry, we still have Republic in the name, you can still vote. And by you I mean the military. And by the military I mean me. And I vote screw democracy, let's just have dictatorship and hope that one day I'll stop massacring the communists. This was the thesis that Sun and the nationalist movement presented, and they understandably lost a lot of support as the movement was wiped out twice before it gained any real traction. After the third military government, however, it began to build a reputation as a real fighting force. Sun died before the movement really expanded, however. Chiang Kai-shek took charge and led a northward expedition, smashing multiple cliques and local governments on his march to Shanghai, and finally, for once it seemed that the country was on the path to unification. The original vision of an industrial, democratic, and Western China could begin. Then Chiang Kai-shek said, "What if we killed all the communists?" And yeah, they did. But Mr. Shrek, isn't it a bit uncultured to round up thousands of people, massacre or sometimes even behead them, in the process committing multiple brutal war crimes, and then fire on students who organize to protest atrocious and appalling actions? Yeah, but imagine this. What if we killed all the communists? This understandably didn't sit well with a lot of people, but the nationalists had unstoppable momentum. By this point, they had won the battle, chasing the communists out of population centers with their far superior military. Everybody expected them to come out on top in this 20-year struggle, and nobody, absolutely nobody, thought that a half-defeated, retreating, and outgunned guerrilla movement led by Mao Zedong in the middle of the country that was rapidly losing steam to turn their luck around. But then, China received a little visit from an unwelcome guest. Spoiler alert, fascists. Fascists like to conquer things. And you know that island called Japan right next to China? Yeah, there's a lot of fascists over there. So Japan began eyeing up its neighbors, intent on unifying East Asia into a prosperous sphere. You can tell it's prosperous by the people stabbing themselves en masse. A combination of surprisingly quick advances, China's political divides, poorly equipped resistance, bad decisions, and the vast superiority of Japanese planning led this collision to be one China would never forget. Because you see, a normal war with China would be a boring slog through a massive country and eventual guerrilla insurgents. Now, committing multiple war crimes and unjust slaughter during it, that's something the whole family can enjoy. And so Japan's army raged through China for years, slaughter after slaughter, massacre after massacre, conquest after conquest. The Chinese were only able to resist at an incredibly high price, with them having to sacrifice most of their best units in a failed attempt to defend the industrial center of Shanghai. But time was on the side of the Chinese. After their at first lightning blitz through the country became a fierce struggle, Tokyo became more and more desperate. A series of Chinese victories would put a slow halt to the empire's advance, and soon, Japan opened up more pressing fronts. Attacking the USA may have temporarily allowed them to seize some of the resources they desperately need, but for every military situation it solved, it created 10 more. For the first time in history, the USA, China, Russia, and the United Kingdom were all on favorable terms, because hating fascists unites everyone. For the time being, however, Japan was unstoppable. They seized Vietnam, Indochina, the Philippines, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Burma, a multitude of strategic islands in the Pacific, and were preparing to take more. Japan had become an epidemic. Clearly, the USA and Japan needed to have a very firm talk. Okay, good talk. Finally, now that Japan stopped massacring my people, I can get back to massacring my people. And then they got massacred by their people. With the Japanese situation put to a decisive finish, China could get back to fighting its number one enemy, China. The nationalists and communists had never really been on favorable terms during the war, but now that there was no unifying threat, they didn't even have to pretend to like each other. Yet a lot had changed in the communists' favor. The CCP avoided large-scale war, direct confrontations, instead employing guerrilla tactics to harass imperial forces. They had been saving their manpower for this war. Comparatively, the nationalists pursued a costly scorched earth resistance campaign against the Japanese. At one point, the nationalists intentionally flooded a river in one of the most populated areas in the world in a desperate attempt to impede the Japanese army at any and all costs. with millions of civilian deaths being considered an acceptable sacrifice. China learned a valuable lesson that year. People dying is bad, though politicians heavily dispute this claim today. The communists built a coalition of people tired of nationalist authoritarianism and common citizens. They now had all the ingredients for a successful communist revolution. So they seized the northern areas, heavily armed with peasants, with one goal: to unite China. And by 1949, they had beaten Shrek and achieved that dream in a glorious and triumphant moment for the Chinese people. Surely the peasants, once slaves to nationalist oppression, will celebrate the great moment for the nation. And the peasants would be celebrating if they weren't all starving to death. With the warlord's era put to an end by the PRC, Mao Zedong now had all the tools he needed to advance China under a successful economic Marxist model. Facing a mainland commie horde, the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan, where they would sell valuable goods, such as not communism. For the mainlanders, however, large-scale organization of a planned economy didn't always go well, and sometimes Mao makes a little oopsie and 30 million people die, and things like this happen. Mao's campaign to purge whatever right-wing elements existed in his bureaucracy led his communist officials to start competing for who could produce the most food, kinda like a capitalist economy. So local production managers had to produce enough food in order to create sufficient surplus to please Mao while still being able to feed all the people. But if we kill all the people... Chinese officials were all too eager to show off their increased production by providing Mao with a lot of extra so-called surplus, but were much less eager to feed their people and show the reality, which was much less increased production. After the death of Mao, large-scale privatization and opening up programs were instated, allowing room for private enterprise. The country also pivoted back to socially moderate values and a brand of more conservative communism under Deng Xiaoping. These reforms happened largely in fear of facing the same collapse that the Soviet Union was undergoing, and allowed China to rebrand themselves to the international community as a reliable alternative to American dominance, an image that they would increasingly begin to champion coming into the 2000s. Coming into the 21st century, China was a changing nation, or perhaps an unchanging nation, as the century of international humiliation, an attempt at radical communism that followed, was beginning to be undone. While America was busy curb-stomping the Middle East, China was concocting a plan for global domination. Step 1, reforms are good, we should start implementing them. Attempting to avert from the same path that Russian communism fell down, China opened its markets to international investment. They had one dream, and that was to become the world's leading producer of cheap garbage. And considering how much cheap garbage the world needs, it's probably not a bad investment. On the other hand, China is also increasingly poking its finger into advanced technology markets, displaying the diversity of this developing economy. It was hoped that the entire country would be liberalized starting from the markets, and this has been somewhat fulfilled, as instead of starving the peasants in famines, we're now running over them with a tank. This is what Confucius would have wanted. So step 1 has been partially achieved, with 60% of the economy composing of private enterprise. However, with a nation so rooted in a history of strong leaders and authoritarianism, it's unlikely that surveillance systems or internet censorship will ever go away. Step 2, make everyone who doesn't want to be China, China. As ancient Chinese dynasties expanded across Eastern and Central Asia, a horrifying reality was discovered: non-Chinese people. This is a threat to national security, and something had to be done. The ideal Chinese society differs from the ideal society of its major global competitor. The American dream is a civilization by which hard work and dedication to freedom means that anyone can strike it rich, and hopefully you only get 3 types of diabetes while doing so. China, by contrast, puts orderly nature at the heart of its culture, and those who differ are often seen as dissidents who are upsetting the stability. People having private lives has gone too far. With CCTV cameras and internet censorship, disobedience among the people of the People's Republic of China is rare, and often only exists in the fringes of the nation. And that pesky island. Step 3 was to make everyone who wants to be China, not China. After immigrating to the island of Taiwan, the nationalists could never really do anything to challenge the overwhelming might of the PRC. While Mao was going for the peasant starvation high score, Taiwan had comparatively less to work with, but maybe it was time to get started on that democracy we were supposed to have finished 60 years ago. The Taiwanese economic, industrial, and political miracle happened a few decades earlier than China's, but still brought prosperity to the island. On the international stage, however, Taiwan struggles to maintain legitimacy and is a bit of a missing identity question on whether the nation is Taiwanese or Chinese. With the PRC hogging up the international stage, Taiwan is recognized by few, however maintains de facto relations with many. No matter how democratic, prosperous, or economically successful the island is, it just doesn't have the same leverage that an emerging superpower like China does. So who actually owns China? China owns China. This assertion is considered controversial by many Chinese. Step 4 was to take over the neighbors. Diplomatically, of course. China had the disadvantage of operating in an American-dominated global sphere, with Washington setting the rules. With the Russian boogeyman who kidnaps and eats children at night gone, however, US foreign policy became much more relaxed and naive. Being able to patch up their international image with a seemingly less totalitarian economic model, China could now begin rebuilding the sphere that had slipped from their grasp. Starting in the 21st century, China began to leverage their economic and geopolitical power like never before by offering investment and aid to countries dissatisfied with the US-dominated world that had fell upon them. Constructing and connecting a string of strategically vital outposts in the Indian Ocean has allowed them to take increasing control over the ever-important global trade that funnels through this region. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Djibouti, Cambodia, and a plethora of East Asian and African states have all opened up to the appeal of letting a superpower build infrastructure, ports, or even military outposts in their countries. Understandably, however, putting yourself in debt to a rapidly expanding superpower whose current mission is an aggressive diplomatic and economic takeover of the world can lead to problems. Debt traps, as well as the fact that China may not be entirely doing this out of the kindness of their heart, should serve as warning signs to countries so disgruntled with American imperialism that they are willing to rely on an authoritarian superpower instead. After all, Chinese dominance over world trade isn't exactly a new thing, and it hasn't always been a good thing either. Regardless of the implications, China continues to build new markets all over the globe, as several developing nations have linked their development to the PRC. Want to improve your infrastructure? Here, have some railroads that you can use to send people protesting your government to death camps. Too many people protesting your government because of the death camps? Here, have some guns that you can use to shoot people protesting your government. Too much criminal activity online protesting the government? Here, have some Chinese surveillance cameras that you can use to spy on people protesting your government. If you at any point decide that building death camps and shooting protesters who are simply complaining about corrupt leadership and increasing Chinese support may have been a bad idea, then don't worry, China will always be there to re-educate you by protesting your government. With a strong economy, sound strategy, and rapidly modernizing military, China is the clear frontrunner to become the next global superpower. The advancements in all areas from tech to military to politics to trade made by the PRC in the last 40 years are stunning. Ranked number 1 in being a genocidal maniac by nobody because the CCP shot them before they could say anything. Wow. In a globe dominated by an endless series of proxy battles and unrest under a US global sphere, China has found its place in this world by building a circle of deeply invested allies right in their backyard. The unpredictability of US foreign policy, which has ping-ponged between interventionism, globalism, and isolationism, leads many nations looking towards this emerging powerhouse as a reliable alternative, definitely not a dictatorial puppet master. So the US better watch its back, or nuke its back, or have a Mexican standoff with its back. I don't really know. The US has a complicated relationship with its back. I don't like to make predictions because in a few administrations' time, who knows what the world will look like. But don't be awfully surprised if you find yourself kowtowing to the almighty will of Winnie the Pooh.